Hello there. Yes, hello. Welcome, everyone. It is December. This is the final Arrow Lakes Historical Society slideshow presentation of 2021. And another year done. Another year of challenges for everyone, but I hope you're all settling in nicely to the holiday season. It's another Friday night, another cold winter Friday night, and yeah, why don't you pull up the old computer screen or television screen or tablet, smartphone, the widescreen projector, whatever you may be watching on, and enjoy a little bit of history online as we take you tonight on a virtual field trip. This is part one of a virtual field trip called FRONTS and BYGONE BYWAYS. As we take you through a journey up the Arrow Lakes and then down the Arrow Lakes. But we'll go down the Arrow Lakes in part two, which comes next month. Today we will start you off in Summit Lake, take you in through Brouse and Glenbank, down Government Hill into Nakusp, and then up the Arrow Lakes to Galena Bay, Beaton, and Arrowhead. Before I get started, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me all right. I don't see anybody in the chat yet, so if anybody can let me know, just so that it looks like I'm all right, but I just want to make sure that we're all right before we begin. In the meantime, I would like to acknowledge that we are in the traditional homeland of the Sinaiax Nation, and we are on territory held sacred by the Sinaiax, the Shwepik, the Tanaha, and the Seal. You may, if you were in Burton or in Edgewood in 2016, you may have seen bits and pieces of this show, as I did a couple of very special shows just for people in Burton and Edgewood. You'll see a bit more of that in part two, but you'll also see some of that material in this one. I've taken the show, which back then would have been in 4:3 format like this, and upgraded it to high def. All right, let's get going as we take you on towards some false fronts and on some bygone byways, and we'll start with Summit, Brouse, and Glenbank. So since it's a field trip, we're following the highway, and we've heard so much about crashes in the news lately, it seems. This is one of the more violent crashes, more spectacular crashes that ever took place along the roads of the Arrow Lakes. This was in 1983, and this is a tanker truck coming out of Calgary with 48,700 liters of fuel. And if you remember those old S-curves between Summit Lake and Hills before they cut those corners off, yeah, some of those can be tricky, especially for the bigger trucks to handle. So as you can see, it's very dramatic. And this is the aftermath of that crash. Now the good news is the driver got out and no one was hurt. But it basically melted the pavement. It was quite intense. As we come to Summit Lake, you can see Highway 6 running along Summit Lake. That peninsula in the middle is where Summit Lake Provincial Park sits, and then you can see the three islands right in the middle. Notice there's no Three Islands Resort / Camp Valhalla yet. This is October 1973, and way up top, right where I'm moving my cursor, that is the ski hill, which would be about 9 years old in this photo. And then right down here on the north and east side of Summit Lake. That's the Nakusp and Slocan Railway. Down here at the bottom, you see one road, and that road is named Allshouse Road. And Allshouse comes from Tom Allshouse, who was, and that's the fellow third from right in this photo, seen here at the Leland Hotel, in the dining room. Everybody's got their party hats on. Tom Allshouse was the president and owner of the Summit Lake Lumber Company, and there actually used to be a town of Summit City, basically right on top of where Camp Valhalla is today. That burned down in 1925. Here's a bird's eye view of the Summit Lake town site. Not huge, but enough that a few dozen people live there. Mostly Swedish. Lots of Swedish loggers and their families lived at Summit Lake. There was actually a Summit Lake school which had about 7 to 10 kids, mostly mostly children of the loggers at Summit City, and most of those families did stick around. Families like the Bjorklunds and the Brons and the Campies and the Alpsons. There's the ruins of the Summit Mill after it burned down. That's Chester Robinson, who was the co-owner of the Summit Lake Lumber Company with Tom Allshouse. And it was a horrific forest fire. It was the 7th forest fire of the season. The first 6 managed to avoid the town, but the 7th one gutted it entirely. Some people actually had to escape on canoes and boats to one of the 3 islands to escape the flames. There is Highway 6 in color in 1956 with the leaves changing. The road's not paved yet. You'll see that little peak at top right. That's called Allshouse Peak, again after Tom Allshouse, and that's the backside of Box Mountain. This is what that highway looked like 40 years earlier. This is as they were logging the highway, what would become the highway between Nakusp and New Denver. So this is somewhere in between Summit Lake and Box Lake. And you'll know that as you drive by Box Lake, you see these giant, skinny, long trees, which they used a lot in the day for making poles. But you can see that swath. It's the same type of trees that are all along Box Lake, and that is Bert Harridge right in the middle there. He was the foreman of this construction crew. As the highway leaves the forest and comes into the farmland of Brouse, again, you don't have a whole lot of modern excavating equipment, so these are the road crews building the highway out of the side of the hill. Art Janelle, son of the famous Janelle family patriarch, who founded the first mill in Nakusp, and his father is for whom the town of Janelle is named after, Jack Janelle. He is part of this work crew here. It's and you'll notice the planks laid down so that the wheelbarrows don't have to get stuck in the mud. Here's a picture of the work crew. Like I said, Art Janelle was part of this work crew at one time, but you'll also see some other common names, like Nick Donseler. We usually think of Donseler as Edgewood, but they were related to all the Dutch families in Nakusp as well, such as the Hogerworths, and there you can see Carl Alton in there. Tom Bowes, one of the earliest settlers of Glenbank, Charlie Gregory, and a whole bunch of long-time Nakusp names in here. Coming into Brouse, so that is Highway 6, what is now Highway 6. And you'll see that one house just left of center that belonged to John Flaming. That's the Gustafson house now, right at the corner of Highway 6 and Brouse Loop. And I believe that building next to it, sort of behind, is could be the could be the Brouse train station, might be a bit big to be the Brouse station. We don't know for sure. But one thing we do know is that house that is still standing there today, 110 years after this photo, came via boxcar from an Eaton's catalog and was shipped here in pieces in 1908. Yes, it's an early version of a modular home that you could actually order out of a catalog for $5,000. And since the house is located right next to the railway, they can just ship it here on a boxcar all the way from Montreal. And the fact that it's still there is pretty amazing. Here's an aerial view. This is taken in the 30s or 40s or so. So going a bit further east on Highway 6, if you're keen, you'll notice that the highway is crossed by the rail line up here at the very top center of the photo, exactly where the rail trail crosses today. So the parking lot for the rail trail is right there. You'll see the Louis Hascarl Sr.'s house at left, and then Charlie Eel's farm is at right, and you have a little siding here at the bottom. And Charlie Eel's store wouldn't have been too far from there, the original Brouse store. Coming into Glenbank, this is an interesting shot of Shakespeare Road, or Shakespeare Avenue. The part within the village of Nakusp is still called Shakespeare Avenue, by the way. If you're really keen and you look on the signs. And then it's Shakespeare Road once you leave the village. This would be right about where the corner of Shakespeare and Glenbank Road is. You can pick out that sort of dip over here at the left-hand side. And then way up here would be where the Bose family, which later became the Friedenberger family, they were already living there at that corner of Shakespeare and what became Hepner. And yeah, that would be about where Kelly Hascarl's house is on the right. This is an aerial shot of the Baird farm, later the Leverington farm, and this is now where the Nakusp golf course is. So this is probably taken about 8 to 10 years before the golf course is built. So you'll see Highway 6 is very straight on the right. Up here at the very top right, that is Alexander Road, but you notice there's no Hilltop grocery yet, so that we know it's not 1962. So it has to be. So it's probably late 50s because construction hasn't even begun on it yet. And this corner at top is not straightened out yet. Zach's Road. There's no curve right at Zach's Road. It's a little past Zach's Road. So they haven't cut that corner off yet. So that's how we know that this is probably late 50s. Here it is in 1990s. Of course, the golf course is there now. And then you can see all the hustle and bustle around the corner of Alexander, Gensick, and Highway 6 with the Hilltop grocery at the time, Carson's Corner, there. And then we see Box Mountain and way off in the distance, Box Lake. Cotswold Road is now there as well. And there is, at the time, Marshall's Hilltop Grocery, because it was Ken and Marilyn Marshall that opened the store in 1962. So it was, this is how it looked from between 62 and 65. Even though it was in Glenbank, it served as the final Brouse post office, in addition to being a grocery store and gas station. Here's a cool shot of it from the front. Notice there's no addition over on the gas pumps were later moved to the other side of the store, and there's no addition on the side yet. And if you go into the store, you can kind of see where they added on to the store where the register is. But those wheels that served as a fence, those were actually taken off of wagons at the Selgar Mill. The Selgar Mill closed in 62, and all those wagons had no purpose anymore, so they made the wheels from the wagons made a nice decorative fence. And I also should point out that you can apparently get 99 cents will plus 7 gallons of gas will get you a 4-piece fine china set. Fast forward 20 years to 1986, and now you can see that the addition to the store in the back has been made, and the gas pumps have been moved to the side. This is during its Carson's Corner era, which lasted from 1979 to 2019. So for 40 years. And then it went, of course, it has now gone back to the Hilltop name. But 54.2 cents a liter. We almost saw that in a couple places in Alberta last year. But boy, they went right back up, didn't they? So now we turn off Highway 6. We go up Alexander Road. And the Powell Ranch is at left. And the creek that runs under Nakusp and comes out at the beach just west of the marina is called Powell Creek. From where it emanates up in Glenbank and then crosses under. As you can see, the roads in Glenbank, they were pretty narrow, very rutted. It's a long time before pavement comes this way, that's for sure. But that's Alexander Road, right at the beginning of Alexander Road. Shakespeare was actually, for the most part, settled a couple years earlier than Alexander. Started filling in a bit earlier. Back to Shakespeare. And you can probably pick out exactly where this is. I mentioned that dip earlier when we saw in that first postcard. This is kind of looking the other way from the top of that dip, further up the hill. And that is May Bill in the middle. And if you know the story of May Bill, it's rather interesting. Supposedly, the illegitimate daughter of Prince Albert, who was sent with her adopted parents, who worked at Buckingham Palace, off to the colonies to sort of keep it on the hush-hush. But the Bills wound up being a pretty prominent a prominent family in Nakusp over the following 3 decades, and these black and white postcards of Shakespeare Avenue that you were looking at were actually taken and published by Ernest Bill. So anytime that, and I'll go back to this, anytime you see a caption like that that looks like it's stamped on, that's an Ernest Bill photo. An Ernest Bill postcard. So this is taken next door to the previous photo. This is the Goldstone Ranch in 1908, John Chandler's house, and you can see the Kirk family house in the background. And what's cool about it is that 113 years later, the Kirks still live in that same lot in Glenbank. It's kind of neat to see families sticking together all these years later as the generations go by and things change so much. Sometimes they don't change as much as we think they do. We move, well, you wouldn't call it one block, one quarter section over to Wells Road, which is named after Stafford Wells, who farmed the piece of property. I'm not sure if it was the Halderson, where the Halderson farm is, if that was Spain's property and Wells was next door, but it's that same area in Sleepy Hollow, Glenbank. So Sleepy Hollow, in case you're wondering, refers specifically to the area focused around Shakespeare and Wells and Hefner and Glenbank roads. We see Tom Abriel, what was Tom Abriel's home ranch, later Mike Fretzel's home ranch, and then Schneeberger's home ranch, way up at the top, and then Nakusp off in the distance. I couldn't find a picture of Stafford Wells, but this is a picture of his brother haying at the home ranch in the 1950s. And I mentioned Ernie Spain, so you get to the end of Glenbank Road to turn off onto Halderson's driveway. You would think it would just be a driveway, but it actually is a right-of-way. And then if you look closely, you'll see Spain's Road. And that's named after Ernie Spain. There he is at the Celgar Mill with Paul Hankey, the younger Paul Hankey, because there are two. And look at the size of the log that's being canted behind them. You don't find too many trees like that nowadays. This is a photo from Ichiro Shino, who was one of their co-workers at Celgar. Now, for many years, during the 80s and 90s, along Spain's Road was the Arrow Lakes Farmers Institute building, which was managed by the Haldersons, and that's Len Halderson in the background there, which leads me to think that the boy in the front, who's not named in the photo, but I'm pretty sure that would have to be Blake Halderson, my dear friend from many years ago. It's hard to believe it's been 21 years since he's gone, but you'd be 3 in that photo, so that makes sense. Speaking of Blake, one of the things he used to tell the younger kids at school was that Stevie's Hill got its name from a kid named Stevie who went sledding down the hill and fell off the side and died. No, that's not true. But Stevie's Hill got its name from the Stevenson family who lived at the top of the hill at the edge of Glenbank. So it's named after John Stevenson. Stevie, short for Stevenson. And that is John Stevenson on the left, and that's his wife Mary, second from the right. Stevie's Hill was closed off to vehicle traffic on the south side in 1983. The pavement's still there, but it's slowly cracking away. And of course, the top side of Stevie's Hill, most of it was removed in 2000 when the bypass came in. Before that, you could actually drive all the way from down Glenbank Road. Glenbank Road would turn left at Spain's Road and then come down Stevie's Hill and meet up with what is now 6th Street. This is what that stretch of road looked like in 1940, 1941. It's the earliest color photo we have of that road. And one of the few photos we have of that road before the subdivision in that area came in 1961. So as you can see, you don't have to go very far out in the Nakusp to get into the woods back then. This would have been a solid kilometer and a half from downtown. Not even. Maybe a kilometer. And yet, it feels just like the middle of the woods. And today, that would be houses. So, we fast forward to 1961. I'll move my cursor over here, and then you can see where the road down Stevie's Hill, Glenbank Road, coming down, and then meeting up with the now under construction future 6th Street. Here, there's no bypass yet, so you're still coming down Government Hill to get into the Nakusp instead of going around. But here in 1961, you can see that they have cut off the corner of Highway 6 here at Zach's Road. This used to be called Decker's Corner for the Decker family that lived there across from Zach's Road. There's no Marshall Road yet either. Marshall Road would be right here. That would come later. Again, named after the same Marshalls of Marshall grocery fame. Hilltop Grocery. And if you look at Nakusp, you'll see that they're just starting to build new subdivisions for the first time in about 50 years. So it took Nakusp that long to fill up before they started building out. And then the Spicer Farm just right of center. So before you get to the Gov, Anybody coming from the east half of Glenbank had to come down along the Nakusp East Road. This is the corner of the Nakusp East and Shakespeare, but what you'll notice off at right is the Glenbank Methodist Church. Yes, Glenbank, many decades before the Alliance Church had its own church. It later merged into the United Church when the Methodist and Presbyterian churches merged in the 20s. But that was the community hall for Glenbank in addition to being the church. And then you can see very sparsely populated Nakusp down in the distance in the hillside below. Here's what the switchback coming down Government Hill looked like. Of course, now that would be the intersection of Highway 6 and Churchill Road and Government Hill Road. Named Government Hill because that was the road that the highway, the government road, took to climb out of Nakusp, out of town. But back then it was just a railway crossing on a switchback. And yes, I should point out, Church Hill Road, two separate words. It is not Churchill. That is a high-rise sign error that was made in 1980 and has simply been carried through for 40 years. But it's legally still Church Hill Road. The village sign still says Church Hill Road. And it is named Church Hill Road because it led to the Glenbank Church. There's nobody named Churchill that it was named after. Coming down Government Hill Road joins up with Nelson Avenue. And, well, this is still a gas station, but it's been through a few iterations. It started off as wards at the end of the 40s, and then very soon after it became Hill and O'Brien. So Vince Hill and Mick O'Brien. And it was a BA station. And if you imagine an awning, you can see that the layout of the actual building is still quite the same. You'll see it here in this next shot. Yeah, now there's a roof over top of the gas pumps, but it's still the same building, and it looks very much the same today, just with different signs. Of course, later on, Richard Anderson and Sheila Anderson would take over the station. It went from BA to Gulf to Petro-Canada to Sun Valley, and now it's AFD. But it's been definitely turned into an institution over the past 70 years. It'd be weird to see that side of town without it. So I mentioned Nelson Avenue because Nelson and Broadway seem to be the only two streets left downtown with actual names. The streets were renamed with numbers in 1970, just after the idea of actually numbering houses came in. This is a plan of the original town site, and it shows you the original street names. Broadway is the same, and Nelson is the same, but the avenues and the streets have names. There's no rhyme or reason to the names that we know of. There are many different theories, but ultimately the answers lie somewhere in a drafting table in 1892 in Vancouver, because the streets were named before there was even a town. It was laid out by the developers. Some of them, Beach Avenue, Columbia, Denver, Spokane, those make sense, but we don't know who the names are. The men or the women, who knows. And you'll notice way over here, it just says road. This is the street that is now facing the hospital. That street never had a name for 50 or 60 years until the hospital was built, and by that time the streets had been numbered. So until they numbered the streets in 1970, that road had never been named, even though people lived on it for 60 years. It's very weird. So we've made it to Broadway. So this is part 1 of our tour. Part 2 comes next month. Part 1 will go along the north side of Broadway. So Why not follow a parade car? Here's the first parade down Broadway, July 1st, 1924. Before that, parades were done on Bay Street, down on the waterfront. But by this point in time, businesses were leaving Bay Street and coming onto Broadway, which was designed to be the main street to begin with. That's why it's called Broadway. That's Chris Hamling Sr. leading the parade. The big building at center in the background is Parkinson's store, and that's where the Valley Food Store is now. And that left, that building with the false front, hence the false fronts in the names, because we have lots of false fronted buildings in the cusp, that is Bergie's Garage. And that house in the middle, the former Jordan house, later the Sophia Hayes house, and then way later on Mindy Paul house, that's where the parking lot for the Valley Food Store is now. So I mentioned the Parkinson store, well, we haven't got there yet. I'm jumping ahead of myself here, because I want to show you that intersection of Broadway and Edith. So that vacant lot in the background behind this hospital auxiliary float in 1967, a few years later becomes Nakusp Collision. And I also want to point out the cool street signs that we used to have. Even they're fingerboards, and they're called fingerboards because they were point like a finger. And we still see some of those in rural areas where they have the little green distance signposts. But that's what our street signs used to look like in the cusp. And of course, the houses in the background are all still there. That's a very cool shot of Hospital Auxiliary Float in full color, 1957. And there is Nakusp Glass and Markin Equipment, or Nakusp Glass, Nakusp Auto Body, / Nakusp Collision. Later, that's where Nakusp Glass went, many years later. But there it is in 1968, and that's still the same building. Then we fast forward to 2010. At this point, it's now Nakusp Glass. There have been a number of businesses that have occupied the other half of the building. At this time, it was a company called Artistic Imaging. There we go. I mentioned the Parkinson store. It burned down in 1939. Nobody was hurt. But, I don't think. But, what replaced the Parkinson store was the Bluebird Cafe. And the Bluebird Cafe sticks around for almost 40 years. Now, you'll notice that the building looks quite a bit different than the current Valley Food Store, because it's not the same building. That version of the Bluebird Cafe, as you check out that cool vintage Pepsi-Cola sign, was replaced in 1973 with the current building. This is looking from the corner of Broadway and Edith again. Looking up Broadway, you'll see the Bluebird Cafe sign. Now it's got a 7-Up sign here. This is in the mid-60s. And then over on the left is the Rice Bowl Cafe. A little preview for next month's show. And then you can see it doesn't... It looks the same and it doesn't look the same. It's odd. You can picture exactly where everything is, but yet you focus in and everything does look so different. And look at that old Esso tanker truck on the right. There you can actually see the bricklayer at right. The finishing touches being put on the brand new Bluebird Cafe building in 1973. And it looks very similar to how the Valley Food Store looks now. It's even the same type of sign. As we fast forward another 10 years and you can see the Valley Food Store. Other than a new color of paint last year, went to more of a slate instead of a red, looks identical. Also, you can see here in the early 80s, we now have a cobblestone sidewalk. So I go back, you can see the sidewalk's not even paved in 1973. It's just a curb and then gravel. And then 1980, 81, the cobblestones come in. And those are the ones that were replaced 3 years ago. So, we hop over across the street, across Grace Street, or Grace Avenue, I should say, which is now 3rd Avenue. And that's Avis and Russell's garage. Avis and Russell ran this garage for about a year after they built it. Then they sold it to Reuben Berge. And so most people knew it as Berge's garage because it was Berge's garage from 24 or thereabout all the way until 1947 when it became Nakusp Motors and went through a succession of owners before the Joneses bought it. This was the beginning of Reuben Berge's automotive empire in the West Kootenay. He became one of the biggest car dealers in the West Kootenay. First based out of this garage, he even went as far as to sell cars off the Needles Ferry. And eventually would relocate to Nelson and create a little automotive empire down in Nelson. And you'll notice that little building off by itself to its left, just left of center, that is the antecessor of what is now Touch of Fashion. Also, notice the one gas pump just hanging out there on the sidewalk. That's where the gas pump was, right on the sidewalk. So in 1947, that building is massively renovated and replaced with the current building. So here we see it. It was always a Shell station until the 90s. 96, it became Gas West. At this time, Don Smith and Charlie Wanstall had bought the business, and we see it begin to look like the building we know now. Here it is in the 80s. This is probably somewhere between 83 and 86. But it looks pretty identical to how it does now. Of course, later the Jones brothers would merge their operations into the building, so Napa moved in, Nakusp Auto Parts. Next door, I mentioned that little building. Well, here's Bailey Shoe Repair at left, and Ed Pickard's shoe repair at right. So I find that pretty funny. Not only that we actually had two shoe repair shops in Nakusp, back before shoes became disposable, like they are now. But that they were located right next to each other. Later becomes Lang's Clothing. And this is a great shot here, because here we see the front of Lang's Clothing, and then here we see the inside looking back out, and there's Bud Lang at left. But you'll notice, if you look at the children peering through the door, in an early version of what would become known as a photo bomb. And then you can actually see Arrow Lake Supply Company in the window across the street. That would be where Selkirk Realty is now. After Lang's, it becomes Crafts Clothing. So you see Crafts on one side, and then the two buildings had not been joined together, because nowadays we know Touch of Fashion is on one side, Trendy Treads Footwear is on the other. But this building combination has always had something to do with clothing. It's amazing how that business, even though there have been many businesses there, how that service has always been located in that building. And if you're wondering why those women are in costume, that was because this was taken during the Centennial. And you'll notice the gas station sign is still hanging in the same place. It's not Shell anymore, it's Gas West, but it's still the same post. After Crafts became Matheson's, then it became Dunn's, or Dunn's, then it became Matheson's. I can't remember which. But you'll notice the street number is 406. And it's not 406 anymore. It's 305, I think. 305 or 309. So they renumbered this. They actually gave houses and buildings in the Nakusp numbers for the first time at the end of the 60s, and then a year or two later renumbered them all again. It was weird. Uh, and then after that, it becomes Paul's Menswear. It was Paul's Menswear until the Valsky family came in the early 80s. I think 84? 83 or 84? But yeah, it's always been a clothing store. So, as we turn around the Masonic building, we come up to the Royal Canadian Legion Hall, which was brand new in 1932. That's when it was built. And in the 60s, 64 is when the lounge gets built onto the side. You'll notice the lounge is kind of missing here, and there's actually windows all on the side. So it's 64, and it's actually, I think, embedded in the concrete. But it looks a lot different than it does now, even though it's very much the same building. And of course, no pavement yet. But there's the inside on the July 1st dance, 1950. And you'll notice that there is a balcony on top. And I remember that balcony as a kid. That's where all the bands would play, the orchestras would play, people would go up and sneak kisses. It was pretty neat. Very quickly became our main hall for events, sort of superseding the small hall, which we'll get to in a bit. Next door to the Legion is the Arrow Lakes Theatre. Arrow Lakes Theatre, built by Bill Brotherton in 1955, and still looks very much the same today. That is Jean Levesque speaking about the history of the Nakusp Brass Band, which is about to perform on the stage behind him. And you'll see the British Columbia Centennial banners all around the wall and up in front of the screen there. It's the same event that those women standing in front of Crafts Clothing a few slides ago were dressed up for in costume. There it is in 1969. I used this photo in the Our Colored Passbook. It's a very rare photo. Amazingly, there are not very many photos of the Arrow Lakes Theatre after a certain point. But that gives you an idea of what it looked like at the end of the 60s. And look at that cool, oddly colored green and yellow marquee. My Side of the Mountain was playing. That's how I know it was 1969. And again, another false-fronted building. So if we head back down to Broadway, next door to Touch of Fashion is Selkirk College, that piece of property was originally occupied by the Royal Cafe, which you see in the background behind this early parade car in 1925, which is dressed up like a moth. The Royal Cafe, which was later renamed the Broadway Cafe, is probably most famous for being the location of the Old West Bank robbery reenactment, which was another British Columbia Centennial event in 1958, and it was filmed by Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. There you see Crafts Clothing at the right, and then in between you have the FT Mamshire Paint Shop. Now, those two buildings would have been used for this reenactment just because they looked like Old West. We didn't have a lot of buildings with balconies on it in along Broadway. Very different than other West Kootenay towns, which had a lot of ornate Victorian architecture and Old West style. We tended to go more the false front route. We didn't have the money that the mining towns did, so buildings tended to be a bit more humble. So even something like the Broadway Cafe stood out. Especially with that neon orange crush sign. Later, after those two buildings were torn down, it was replaced in 1986 by the Manor Restaurant, and that's the building that houses Selkirk College today. And every Saturday for 17 years, that's where you would find my family for sure. So again, we move around the Masonic building, which looks the same as it did back in 1922 when it was built. We go across the street to the Thomas Abriel office. And if you're struggling to picture where this is, it's because this building doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down about the beginning of the 60s. This was built by Thomas Abriel, early entrepreneur of Nakusp, to house his business offices on the bottom and the International Order of Foresters Hall, or Woodsman Hall, on top. And again, another very prominent false front building. If you wonder why they built those, it was simple. It made the top floor look bigger than it actually was. So what's cool is that one on the left is from the 1890s. You don't see too many photos of Broadway in the 1890s. You see a lot on the waterfront in the 1890s, not so much Broadway. That should give you an idea of where this is. It was torn down, and the Brownie's Fried Chicken restaurant was later built there. That was Perfecto Pizza, very briefly, the end of the 80s. And then Picardo Fine Dining. It opened there in 1990, and that is what eventually became Chumley's. The pub in between Picardo / Chumley's and the building next door, the former Opera House, that was built in 97. This is a cool shot. 1911, because two of these buildings still exist. The one on the left, of course, is the courthouse. Looks identical other than the stairs. The building in the middle, the Opera House, is still there, and that's where I'm broadcasting from tonight. But it's been heavily renovated over the past 5 years. And then I mentioned the Abriel office doesn't exist. But what's cool is how different completely Broadway looks. This may as well... You wouldn't even know there was a street there unless I told you that was a street. That's the actual street in front of these buildings. It just... There's still stumps on it. There's still grass on it. There's the Opera House, along with the exhibition building attached to the side. This was built to house plays, and it was built to house the Nakusp Fall Fair, again by Thomas Abriel, who built the building next to it. And it operated as an opera house until 1952. Shortly thereafter, it became the first BC liquor store in Nakusp. This is a great shot. Again, you can see the sidewalks aren't paved, they're just curbed. You can see the Dumont Motel, which is currently the CMH Lodge. And it totally looks the same, except it's completely pastel. What an odd... It's the 60s. And then on the left, you can see the signs from the Nakusp Credit Union and the Bon Marché. The Nakusp Credit Union, that's where the Air Lakes Integrative Health Center is now. And Bon Marché is still Bon Marché. There's what the Opera House looked like in 1985, after it had become Nakusp Auto Parts, and Warren Jones had moved in. And for a time, not only did he operate Nakusp Auto Parts out of there, but he also had the Pop Shop franchise. And if, for those of you younger than 30, the Pop Shop was basically like the predecessor of the Soda Stream. You couldn't buy Pop Shop Pop in stores, like at the supermarket or the corner store. You actually went to a franchise dealer and they filled a crate full of pop, and you would choose different flavors, and you'd get like a dozen pop bottles in a crate. And they had like 60 different flavors. It was ridiculous, but it was very much like driving to a Soda Stream machine. But for anybody that grew up in Canada in the 70s or 80s, that was a big thing. Very big thing. There's the courthouse, and if you remember the trees that used to be in front of the courthouse, they used to light up before they chopped them down a few years ago. Those trees were planted in front of the courthouse in 1952. And here's the actual planting ceremony. It's interesting because this photo is taken at night, so you don't usually see a lot of night photos outdoor. from this time period. So, there they are in 1978. They grew up tall very quickly. Sadly, one got rotten, so it had to be taken down, and it would look kind of silly to just have the one tree. So they took them both down, but you can see the one tree's dead. So they had to go. But it's crazy to see how much they grew in just over 70 years. 60 years. Yeah, 63 years. Yeah, it's already 2015 since they come down. I can't believe it's been that long. Behind the courthouse was the parish hall, which everybody knew was the small hall. That was the local community hall, again built by Thomas Abriel, 1898, to serve as a base for community events. While it was superseded by the Legion Hall for big events, for smaller gatherings, it was the home to a lot of events. It was even the home to the public library for a time. Here it is in 1952. That's Marion Cusick on the left. She was the librarian at the time. And then inside, on the top floor of the small hall, was this little library. And that's the same library. Our library traveled to a lot of different places around town before it finally landed in its current location, the Centennial building, in 1957. So for the first 30 years of the library, it was kind of a transient operation. You just take a look for a couple of seconds there, or pause it, because you can pause this. And see if you can recognize any of those names on the bottom. A lot of prominent Nakusp families represented by those adorable little children. After the small hall ceased to be a community hall, it became a secondhand store called the Trading Post, which operated for most of the 70s until it was time for it to come down, because the liquor store was moving out of the old Opera House and moving to its new location to where it is now. So that'll give you an idea of where the Trading Post is. That's the Legion in the background. That's the old Lord Minto Nick's Place Presbyterian Church to the left. So they demolished it by fire. And if you go back here, you see this little addition that's housing a cobbler here in this photo. Well, in 1973, that became the original location of the Lord Minto. Here's the Lord Minto. Not a restaurant yet. At this time, it was still an ice cream parlor, cafe, deli. This is it a week before it opened in 1973, and there is its proprietor, Bob Nowak. And that's such an awesome shot. And look at that ridiculous 1970s belt buckle. That was the time. The next year, the Lord Minto moves next door into the old Presbyterian church, built 1898. You can pretty much count the number of buildings built in the 1890s in Nakusp that are still left on both of your hands. So it's still around. Of course, in 1999, this becomes Nick's Place. But for its first 25 years as a restaurant, it was the Lord Minto Steak and Pizza Restaurant. And lots of fond memories there. My sister obsessed over their escargot. Back on Broadway now, as we continue moving down the street. This house, which belonged to Grace and James Hakeman, sitting by itself in the middle of the block. You wouldn't know where this was in Nakusp, except for at the very left you can see the staircase of what is now the Centennial building, where the public library and the museum and the archives are. And back then it was the school. So that tells you that this sits right in the middle of the block, of where the CMH Heli Skiing Lodge is. The lodge at Arrow Lakes. And so that house was torn down to make way for the 1961 construction of what was then called the Dumont Motel, Carl Dumont's motel that he built here. And originally the building was half the size of what it is now. It was the side facing the courthouse. And where the lobby is now is actually a drive-through to get to the parking lot in the back. So it stood like this for 7 years. 6 years. 1967, they add an addition on the other side of that drive-through portal, so you can see where the people are standing here in this parade photo on that balcony. That's the addition. Of course, that's where the heli skiers dining lounge is now at the Lodge at Arrow Lakes. And I mentioned before that weird pastel color. This is the Arrow Lakes Winter Follies Parade. For a few years at the end of the 60s and early 70s, there used to be a winter carnival in Nakusp. There it is in the early 80s. It's no longer the Dumont Motel, it's the Dumont Motor Inn, and the colors are a very late 70s yellow and black. You can see the drive-through is still there though, and up until they redid the sidewalks at the end of 2018, you'll notice that that curb was always depressed right there. And if you weren't old enough to remember the drive-through, you would be wondering, why is the curb depressed in front of the lobby? Well, that's why. It was a few years after this photo that they did the big renovation to get it looking how it looks now. So I mentioned the Centennial building, built in 1910, or built in 1912, sorry. In fact, you can even see construction materials lying in front of it. This was the third Nakusp school. This was built to replace the building that you see on the right, where the school board office is now, because, oh, no worries, Trevor. Just saying hi to Trevor in the chat. You can always, rewind it. You can even pause the live stream and go back and rewind it and catch up. That's one of the awesome things about doing it this way. It doesn't matter when you start watching. So you'll see the school class here. The elementary school kids went to school in this building, and the high school kids would now start going to school in the smaller building. But these windows on the bottom, as far as we know, still probably the original windows that are still there 110 years later. Melissa Koftanoff was mentioning that. Here it is in 1940. Earliest color photo we have. And now we see the maple trees, 3 years old in this photo, planted for King George's coronation, 1937. Now they dominate the entire street. The school field is now where the post office is. And 1949, the elementary kids move out. NES is built. 1957, the high school 1956, the high school kids move out to the new high school. And so the library moves in, and then in 1964, the village of Nakusp is incorporated. The village moves in, so the museum moves in 68. So the three tenants share the building, and then later the village gets its own standalone building, and the library takes over the whole top floor. Here's what it looked like in 1970-71. So you can see it now has the name Centennial Building. The Village and the Nakusp office is on the right, library on the left, and the museum / visitor center, the little porthole down the bottom. This is a cool shot. April 1978, inside the library. Anybody who's regular patron of the library knows Sarah's Corner, named after the little girl, Sarah Van. who passed away in 1976. That corner is dedicated in her name. And here it is when it was founded in 1978, and it's still a children's reading section to this day. And the treasurer of the library at the time is Peter Ralston, the late great Peter Ralston. So I wanted to throw that photo in there. Now it's time to leave Broadway, head uptown. So we come up to the Green Door Cafe, and there's Peggy Fellows standing in front of the Green Door Cafe. There's no bowling alley yet. So notice there's no bowling alley in that blank part on the right. It's just the cafe. This is later the section that becomes the Village Bread and Pastry Shop. It's the Green Door Cafe opens in 1957, named after a popular song of the time. 5 years later is when the bowling alley comes in. Here's the banquet room of the Green Door. A rare photo of the Green Door banquet room. This is where the arcade would later be. In its later days. This is a Japanese supper held by the Connect Club. And it was the Connect Club that founded the Nakusp Museum originally in 1968. And there are the brand new lanes. They were called the High Arrow lanes, since High Arrow was a on our minds very much during the 60s. What's cool is all the different bonuses that you would get for the different combinations of strikes or bowling achievements. All the different businesses sponsoring prize money. So some cool vintage advertisers. And those were the same balls forever and ever. The same bowling ball returns, the same pins, the same lane, the same wood on the lanes all the way through its existence. Sadly, we all know what happened. 2006, it burned. The youth center at the time had just taken it over. But, pretty sad shot here. The shell of the lanes remained for another decade until it was finally torn down 3-4 years ago, something like that. We now move up Canyon Road, named Canyon Road because it led to Nakusp Canyon, which is where current Highway 23, the Canyon Road, crosses Kuskonax Creek. This is probably taken from around the location of the modern RCMP Wilf Hewitt Repairs Highways Yard area. So it tells you how far out of town that was back in 1940, because there's nothing. By the way, I really, 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 really have to stress, Highway 23 ends at the SO. Google Maps is not a mapping authority, it is not a government surveying agency. Highway 23 ends at the SO. It has since. The bypass was completed in June 2000. Highway 6 does a complete loop around town. What's confusing is that Canyon Road is no longer a legal street name. In 1998, the village had designated that entire stretch with the civic address, Highway 23. So, and then of course the provincial government, when the highways were realigned, changed the numbering. Once Highway 23 ended at the SO, Highway 6 now comes along the bypass and then comes down all the way through town. So there's 4 blocks of Provincial Highway 6 that lie on civic address Highway 23, and I think that's where the confusion lies. This is looking from the front of Hewitt Repairs, looking towards what was then the Imperial Oil Bulk Plant. And then you'll notice the sign in miles, if you squint, over at left, leading you to the Galena Bay Ferry in Revelstoke. There's the original version of the Canyon Bridge, Kuskonax Creek Bridge. I wouldn't be taking too many trip trucks over that. But it gives you an idea of why it's called Canyon Road. It is a little bit like the canyon there. It does definitely funnel. There is Highway 23, modern Highway 23, being constructed over top of the river. That rock cut that we now drive through before we turn off to go to the public, or to go to Galena Contractors and the Water Bridge Yard and the old mill, that was blasted in '66. As they finally took the logging road that existed between Nakusp and Galena Bay and turned it into Highway 23. This is a cool shot. Information Center, 1 mile. I mentioned the Information Center, which was the museum. This was, now that we actually had a highway leading to Revelstoke, we needed signage. So here's Glenn Weatherhead, president of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, posing with the new sign. And then, of course, the next year we went metric, and so having a 1 mile sign was a waste of effort. I don't know. Here's another. We just lost Floyd. This is Floyd Lillies, a later president of the Chamber of Commerce, 10 years afterwards. Right with the Kuskonax Creek Bridge at the very background. Paying homage to some of the traveling cars at a vintage car rally in the Cusp. And check out the top hat. As we head up the road, of course, get the turnoff to the Nakusp Hot Springs. Nakusp Hot Springs, the modern complex, opened in '74. The road was completed the year before that. It wasn't paved for the first 20 years? 25 years? That's the original sign off the highway leading you to the hot springs, and there you can see a highways worker painting lines on the road in a very safe and not at all incredibly insane and frankly stupid manner. But that's how things run. To Galena Bay and beyond. Of course, there was no highway to Galena Bay until the end of the 60s. And there wasn't even a logging road to Galena Bay until '56. When you come into the actual area of Galena Bay, where the ferry landing is south of Galena Bay, even though we call it the Galena Bay Landing, it's not actually on the bay. The first thing you'll notice when you turn off Highway 31 and start heading towards Galena Bay and Trout Lake is Olson Road, and that's named after the Olson family, who farmed there for many years. John Olson was one of the earliest non-native settlers of Galena Bay. From Sweden. And there's the Olson family home in 1991. And this is a cool shot of the historical society members saving some of this old farming equipment and transporting it down to the museum. And I'm sure this is still stuck in the museum somewhere. But, yeah, Lucia. Milt Parent and Bob Murphy's driving the truck, and then Lucia and Tom Moffat, who lived in the Cusp for many years. The name Olson, most of you would probably be familiar with Winnie Eel. That was John Olson's daughter. Right in the middle of Galena Bay settlement is Dedisenko Road, and I threw a picture of the Dedisenko family up. Well, I don't use Facebook. I had Greg Nesteroff throw a photo of the Dedisenko family up on Facebook last month, and it got a lot of response just because the story is so unique. The Dedisenkos worked for the Russian royal family, and came here to sort of escape a family dispute. First they went to England, and then from there came to Galena Bay, a very remote place for a family that was used to the finer things in life, but they definitely made a life and married into the Shaw family. And the Dedisenko / Shaw family were by far the largest family in Galena Bay, and their descendants are all over the Nakusp and Revelstoke areas to this day. Here's a picture of the Dedesenkos in front of their cabin home, which is on what is now Dedesenko Road. As you leave Galena Bay, you cross over the Galena Pass, and then you turn off to Beaton. If you keep going past Beaton, you'll head towards the ghost town of Camborne, and I believe they're trying to deactivate that road. This is the trestle bridge alongside the wall of the Incomplex River Canyon, Fish River Canyon, as locals would know it. This is in 1920, so this is one of the first cars to drive over this bridge in 1920. They get a lot more snow than they do down here at Valley Bottom. Once you get a couple kilometers west or east of the lake, then the moisture almost doubles. So the amount of lake you get up in the upper Lardeau, Camborne area is immense. And you can imagine what plowing it was like in winter, especially here back in the 30s, where you had to keep that road open for people to get to the mine. In the middle of the Great Depression, Camborne had a small mining boom. It had already been a ghost town once before, but it came back to life for a few years in the 30s before becoming a ghost town once again forever. Here's that same stretch of road, 2007, a massive rock slide. At this point, there was actually a hostel on the other side, and they had no way of getting to the outside world, so they had to build this little step ladder to go over top of this rock slide. Pretty amazing shot. I mentioned before that the Galena ferry landing is not actually at the settlement of Galena Bay. Well, neither was the original one. The original Galena ferry landing was actually on the north side of the Thumb, Storm Point, that little peninsula that sticks out that you see as you cross the Upper Lake Ferry. It was directly opposite Arrowhead, and the ferry would sort of do a triangular run between Arrowhead, Beaton, and Galena Bay before coming all the way down to Nakusp. So you can see the ferry landing here. You're looking across to Arrowhead, which is already on its last legs here, and then the Arton Lumber Mill is on the right. And MV Lardeau held 10 cars, by the way. That's what we replaced the Minto with. The MV Lardeau that held 10 cars. A bit of a difference from the 85-car ferry that we have now. Old Arrowhead. So, here's what Arrowhead looked like in its heyday. Well, a sliver of it. This is just a fraction of it. Arrowhead was almost 1,000 people at its biggest. This is Front Street, named because, of course, it fronted the lake. This is 1906 or earlier. And then to the east of the main town site was what was the Arrow Lakes Lumber Company mill site. That's later where the Arton Lumber Company emerges in the 50s. Those are bunkhouses for the mill employees on the hillside, those little cabins. There's a great shot of Front Street at its most ornate. Much of Arrowhead burned down in 1906, so when it was rebuilt almost immediately, the buildings that replaced the originals were very fancy looking. Lots of balconies and turrets. And very cool. I'll go back and you can see the difference in the hotels. Like, you can see the Union Hotel and then look at the Union Hotel here. You know, so much more ornate. This was also the end of the line for the railway, coming from Revelstoke, and everything would... The station and wharf, the train station and wharf are off at the right. You can see that there's a stern wheeler there waiting to grab cargo and passengers and take them down to Nakusp and points south. The John Bull store, you may know John Bull as sort of the Uncle Sam character of the United Kingdom, but here's an actual owner of a store. His name was John Bull, as far as we know. And he's standing in the middle of this shot here, in front of his men's clothing store. There's the Lakeview Hotel. Look at what an amazing piece of architecture that is. And here's an Orangeman parade. Depending on your opinion of Orangeman, you might think this is really cool. You might think this is not so cool. But again, that's along Front Street. I don't know what this is a photo of. It's just a group outing at Arrowhead, 1906, but it's a neat shot of some of the residents. We do know who the people in this photo the people are. The Lawton family. The Lawton family eventually settles in Ferguson, and they own the Lardeau Hotel for decades. This is a great shot of what the train looked like as it came into Arrowhead, rounding the rock wall at the base of Mount Sproat. Cool thing about this photo, this was actually found in a second-hand store in Nelson. And somebody had the good fortune to bring it to us. Or foresight to bring it to us. Here's the flip side of train travel back in the day. So you can see these boxcars have lost the plot, have completely derailed. William Gilchrist of Arrowhead is second from the left. Log whirling at Arrowhead. Pretty young to be doing it, too. Those kids look like they're between about 10 and 15. Here's the Arrowhead Orchestra. I'm pretty sure there were actually more than 4 people in the Arrowhead Orchestra, but I just love the idea of an orchestra with 4 people in it. I've seen other photos where there's more than 4 people in the Arrowhead Orchestra, don't worry. The South Asian community in the Arrow Lakes doesn't get talked about very often, but we did have substantial populations of South Asian people, mostly Punjabi, in Arrowhead and even in Nakusp, working in the mills in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And this is a Sikh cremation ceremony at Arrowhead in 1907. As I mentioned, Arrowhead was the head of navigation on the Upper Arrow Lake, where the stern wheelers met the train, and here are 3 stern wheelers for the price of 1: the Rossland, the Bonington, and the Minto. And you can see how we think of the Minto as this great, grand ship, especially seeing its sister ship, the Moy, in Caslow. But they are dwarfed by the Bonington. The Bonington, which is the sister ship of the SS Sycamoose in Penticton. So if you go to the SS Sycamoose in Penticton, that'll give you an idea of how large the Bonington was. It was a pretty massive ship with 4 decks. There's the Minto on its final run at Arrowhead. The original wharf at Arrowhead was located right at the mouth of the Columbia River, where the Columbia River emptied into Upper Arrow Lake. This is before the dam, of course, so when I mean emptied in, it was literally a river delta there. And so it silted up under the wharf, and by the beginning of the 50s, they had to build a new wharf because it was just impossible to use that wharf. The Minto never got to use the new wharf. You can actually see the crane at right building the new government wharf, which was completed 6 weeks after the Minto was pulled out of service. So that wound up servicing the new ferry. But there is the Minto with the reef on the bow on its last sailing at Arrowhead. That was located next to the Art and Lumber Company, right at the Art and Mill yard is where the new wharf is being built here. And you can actually see trucks on barges, and the Minto at right, and the Minto is just off camera. Oh, no, no. This is taken from the Minto. Excuse me, sorry. This is a Dr. Maxfield photo. So this is taken from the Minto on its final sailing, looking at the new wharf that it will never get to use. By this time, Arrowhead's already fading away. There were a couple hundred people left at the end, if that. This is St. Cuthbert's Anglican Church at Arrowhead in the winter of 1966. It's gone the next year. It's already abandoned here by this point, as you can see, because nobody's shoveling around it or anything. This is the original hospital at Arrowhead. This is before 1906. This building, believe it or not, was actually moved out of Arrowhead a couple decades later and used as a farmhouse at 21 Mile, so the Sidmouth area, which would be right around where you cross Cranberry Creek on Highway 23 if you were to draw a straight line down to the lake, or slash river, depending on the time of year. That's about the 21 Mile area. Maybe even a bit south of that. This was the original Imperial Bank at Arrowhead. Later became the Arrowhead Co-op. This is as seen from in front of the gas pump. Well, again, one of those cool gravity gas pumps. The Union Hotel is in the background. It's a very awesome shot. And another awesome shot. This is an Ichiro Shino shot. This is a train from Revelstoke arriving at Arrowhead, or leaving for Revelstoke, maybe. And you can see the co-op building / Imperial Bank in the background. Train ran until the 60s. Here's Arrowhead, mid-20th century, not as dense as it was a few decades earlier. You can still make out some of the street blocks, but it's definitely starting to get taken over by trees in some places. Like I said, 100 people living there still at this point. There's Arrowhead near the end, 1965. It's not Crawford's Red and White store, the old Union Hotel. It's Tony Temrick's Red and White store. Crawford's had it before, but it wasn't red and white, despite what the caption says. But that's the Union Hotel, which is basically the last business in town, the last store in town. Hotel, cafe, general store. So Crawford's retired in 57, and Tony Temrick ran it for the last 11 years of Arrowhead's existence. And notice, Front Street is paved, because that's part of Highway 23 at that point in time. And then we'll end you off here with a few shots of the Big Bend Highway, which is a bit out of our jurisdiction, but we do get a lot of photos of it just from people's collections. And this is an interesting shot because these are Galena Bay residents standing in front of Woodenhead at Boat Encampment, which would be located right in the middle of Kinbasket Lake, north of Mica Creek nowadays. This would be underwater. But Woodenhead was carved by one of the construction foremen during the construction of the Big Bend Highway, and or one of the people working on it, and the foreman liked it so much that he said, oh, we could use this as a roadside attraction. So they actually used this as sort of a Smokey Bear type mascot. That sign in the back says, don't be wooden-headed. Drive carefully. You'll live to enjoy the scenery more and longer. Later, before the Big Bend Highway was flooded, they took Woodenhead and preserved him in a park in Revelstoke. So as you cross the Columbia River Bridge in Revelstoke, to right next to the A&W, that's Woodenhead Park, and you will see Woodenhead in his little mini gazebo. But that was created by somebody who actually worked on the Big Bend Highway. And Sid Leary of Nakusp was the Minister of Public Works when the Big Bend Highway was opened in 1940, so he got to make the speech and cut the ribbon. And there's a great color shot, one of the few color shots you'll ever see of the Big Bend Highway. This is all under, depending on where this is, I don't know exactly where this is. This is either under Lake Revelstoke or it's under Kinbasket Lake. But this would be underwater regardless. Kinbasket Lake was created by Mica Dam. And this gives you a really amazing view of how huge this dam is and thus how large that lake is. Look at the drop. That's a quarter of a kilometer in height, Mica Dam. It's one of the largest earth-filled dams on the planet. Revelstoke Dam came in 1984, so this is it under construction in 1983. Revelstoke Lake isn't nearly as big, but Revelstoke Dam is a pretty colossal construction project regardless. And that's the end of Volume 1. So, like I said, we'll be back next month after the break with Part 2, where we head back down through Trout Lake and the Lardeau, come back down to the Cusp. We'll do the south side of Broadway, and then we'll head into the Narrows. We'll do Arrow Park and Burton and Fauquier and Needles and Edgewood. It should be another fun time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I just want to make sure what that date is next month, so I'm just going to look over here. That would be January 21st, Friday, 7 p.m. We'll see you right back here. I'm Kyle Cush, Arrow Lakes Historical Society Archive Tech, and I thank you so much for watching. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year, whatever you celebrate. Have fun, stay safe, and we'll see you in 2022. Hooray!